Okay, hello. Um, I'm Erica Anderson, co-founder and CCO of Storytell, and I am really excited and really grateful to have these esteemed panelists joining us for a really important conversation about building AI with integrity. And in a moment, we'll get into who is joining us, and really have this conversation around, you know, even starting with what do we when we talk about AI, what are we talking about? When we're talking about AI with integrity, what does that mean? And really just inviting all of your voices into the conversation. This is a global conversation, and it needs to be. And I think just a little bit about like why are we here? Why did we decide to have this webinar? As I saw the most recent wave of AI in the form of conversational chatbots start to take off in spring of 22, I also felt, okay, how do we build this right? How can we do this in a way that serves humanity? How can we do this in a way that expands our consciousness as opposed to numbing it? And so those are big questions. And in the space of, this company building and survival as a early stage startup, which is my perspective that I'm coming with, it's hard to sit with those questions every day. Sometimes it's going to have a lot to get done. And I'm sure that's true for many of us. Like, how do we live these values? So our focus, and I'll come back to this in a bit, just for anyone who's joining later, but it's really going to be more on the practical side than theoretical. I think to start with these foundational pieces and just moving into, okay, what can I do? What are actions I can take or really advocate for? So with that, I would love to move into introductions. And Alex, could you kick us off?
I certainly can. Thank you, Erica, and thank you so much for having me. My name is Alex Riepsam. I am two things. I am the Vice President of Research Expertise and Knowledge at Singularity, which is how Erica and I have met. I'm also, and was long before that, a researcher in responsible AI, actually before it was called responsible AI. My background is in philosophy of technology, specifically in epistemology. So my research is always focused on how we translate the world of that we feel and see and smell around us into data that our AIs can make sense of, and what does and doesn't make it through those translations.
Alex, quick question for you. What was it called before it became responsible AI?
It wasn't called anything. It was just people complaining about the technology that everyone loved at the time. Like, this is 2015, right? So it's like the height of machine learning. And then there was like a small research niche of people saying like, well, it might not be able to do quite all the things that people, are currently saying. And then it's just like, no, you just don't understand. No, you're just a naysayer. So it didn't have a name.
Okay, it feels better that it has a name now. And just a big welcome to everyone. We've dropped in a poll here. Would love to know where you're joining from if you want to share. And also, what does it mean to you to build AI with integrity? And we have some options of what that might mean. Otherwise, drop anything in chat or in the Q&A. So thank you so much for joining us. Alia, would love to hear from you.
Yeah, thanks. Hope I'm on mute. Yeah. Hello, everyone from Ljubljana, Slovenia. My name is Alja Isakovic Šidej. I am the co-founder and chief product sculptor at Ethics, a social venture where we aim to craft tools and narratives to close the ethical intent to action gap in product development. And I have been focusing on improving tech and also education with imagination, innovation, and inclusivity for nearly 2 decades now in different roles. And I've been focusing more intensively on responsible tech development in the past couple years. And of course, now that everyone is obsessed with AI, I'm also focusing more intensively on responsible AI and environmental impacts of AI. And to also answer your previous question, Erica, what it was called, I think we used to talk about AI, just AI ethics, and it wasn't really being taken seriously. I know, like I did a 1 year of PhD in computer science, and ethics was this like soft, squishy thing that nobody really wanted to talk about because it wasn't really serious, hard computer science. And I'm not sure that has quite changed yet, but hopefully with conversations like this, we can do our part and have these important conversations and highlight some ethical concerns, which I think is a nice segue into chat.
Yeah, completely. So from soft, squishy to something that's concrete that we can feel, act on. All right, Chad.
Yeah, hey, I'm Chad Woodford. I'm coming to you from Los Angeles. And I actually began my career about 30 years ago as an AI researcher on the technology side. So I was working on neural networks in the early days and trying to get an AI to play the game of Go and all that stuff. And then I worked as a software engineer in that field for a while, but it was pretty early. It was too early, so there wasn't much happening. And so I got more interested in technology policy and became a technology lawyer. So I spent over a decade working as a technology lawyer in Silicon Valley for a lot of the big tech companies, and I started to just kind of watch the new wave of AI come, and I started to take more interest in that, so more recently, I just finished a master's in philosophy, and my interest now is in the intersection of philosophy and technology and AI, and I'm working on a book right now actually on what it means to be human in the age of AI.
Mm, that's an amazing question. Yeah, I definitely want to read that and whatever comes before it as well, I think can be almost like a stealth startup. There is no book, then suddenly there's a book, but often there's, a journey to that.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, love what you wrote, Alia. Yes, welcome to all the humans.
Yeah,
So
because we
yeah.
an interesting comment on the chat, actually. We got a couple of greetings from assistants that are helping transcribe this meeting, which I find very curious. So hoping to hear from some humans as well, and that we're not just talking to AI assistants transcribing what we're saying.
For sure. Yeah, I know. We sometimes get on meetings or calls and it's more bots than live people. But maybe we can teach the bots too.
Maybe the
So
bots will absorb some of the ethics discussion.
right. So as you might have noticed, this away from a human. That's great. Great to see you here, Court. Um, other people that I've met at Responsible AI and Humane Tech events are joining us, so I can attest to them being real. Um, so as you may got it, we've got carbon-based life forms. So if you may have noticed, so this being recorded and live streamed is to share it with everyone who's joining now and joining in the future. And yes, please do share where you're joining us from. Looks like real humans really do want to stand up. And we might do like some questions as we go, and largely we'll get into questions like towards the end. But I just want to share two things, and so I will share my screen here in a moment. This is not a slide heavy situation. I have all of 2 slides that I'd like to share just to set kind of where we headed and looking a little bit also at your relationship to AI. And so starting here, so a bit of what I was speaking to in the beginning, that our intention in this webinar is really to focus on the practical. So how do I bring these ideas about AI and live them in practice, as opposed to an entirely theoretical conversation. You know, we've got these incredible people with us today, and I think what's really going to be meaningful for them, but also I'm guessing for all of you who have joined, is how do we move the needle? So continuously move from the soft, squishy thing to something that's really real and concrete. And oh, I know I at least have an idea of an action I can take from here. But we want to start with the shared foundation. You know, when we say AI, what do we mean? What is AI? And as you know, Angela dropped the poll in, like, what does integrity in AI mean to you? So just teasing these things apart. Like, okay, maybe it means we're aligning AI to human values. Well, whose values are those? We have different values in different countries. Western values tend to get imposed on the world. And then coming back to process. So how do you use AI ethically, you know, in your role, in your organization? What does that mean? And then here, this is a, a slide really specific to my startup, and it's just a way of thinking about your relationship to AI. It may resonate, it may not. Happy to get feedback on it. It's just our initial take here of where are you vis-a-vis AI? And a lot of these examples are really focused on conversational chatbots, so on ChatGPT. And this is the scale we've noticed. And I would say even at conferences around ethical use of AI, I hear different things from people who are more in the avoidant camp versus curious, for instance. Um, and so I think this isn't a, you know, anti-technology conversation. It's not an anti-AI conversation. That it doesn't even make sense to be those things because we are in, you know, an age of AI. It's how do we partner with? So that's at least my orientation around it, and just wanting to share that context with everyone in case that's helpful. So, okay, and hopefully we're having some tech issues. So it looks like maybe we lost Chad to me, but hopefully Chad will be back soon. Otherwise, we're representing Europe here. And so I just want to open it back up, Alia and Alex, to you. If someone were to ask, what is AI? How do you approach that? And whoever wants to jump in first. We're doing
Alex,
it
you
email
go
here.
ahead, given that you have more background in AI. I'll let you kick us off.
I saw us unmute at the same time.
Yeah.
I think for me, yeah, I think when this is like a question that's I have actually recently given together with a friend and colleague of mine, given a presentation about what is AI to a group of senior citizens in San Francisco, because they're like, well, we keep hearing about this, what is it, right? And so you can't go in with, well, it's this, that, and that technically. And so what we talked about, not to say that, but I think it's helpful for us to think about, like, how would you explain this to a senior citizen, right? How would you explain this to a toddler? And then of course you have to make a decision about, like, what of the many kinds of AI are you representing? We chose to represent machine learning because that's still sort of like at the foundation of everything that we interact with today, and what in most cases people mean when they say AI. And what we discussed was, like, ultimately what this is when you have many examples of a certain action, a certain decision, or a certain outcome, you can show this to a statistical machine in some way or other, whatever's driving that. And it can learn what statistically is the most likely outcome. If were you to present it with a first, so let's say there's 1 and 2, there's step 1, step 2, you show the statistical calculation machine what comes first, what comes second, and then you show it, this is what step 1 is, now what is most likely to be step 2. I found that kind of worked. It's not perfect, but I found that it kind of works, because from there you can build to all sorts of like applications of AI that we are used to, right? Be it, and I think this, well, I won't get ahead of myself, but this goes to, maintenance prediction in manufacturing, as well as ultimately where it's sort of like, what are the conditions that we know when they're hit, something is likely to break down. And that's sort of like an AI that has learned when these conditions are met, this is likely to break down, all the way to a generative AI that's generating a picture. And if these are the things that's being asked for, then these are likely the pixels that it needs to be, obviously at a much more complex and much more scaled up level. But bringing it back down to understanding really any AI, and I think I find it actually really helpful to use a model like this to also think about when you're encountering an AI, what would be the sort of like most reduced version of this? What's the first thing it gets and what's the second thing it generates, or like it decides, or whatever. I found this model kind of works in most cases. So that's how I would answer that in terms of if you want to get practical, right? What I find doesn't usually help is what a lot of conversations are about is just a list of things AI can do, which is a lot. And so you can talk forever, but it doesn't get us anywhere closer to like what it actually is.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you, Alex. Alia, did you want to step in?
Yeah, I think a simple definition for me would be it's basically different types of computer programs that are looking for some sort of patterns in different types of data. And obviously that can be super simple. It can be, basic statistics, like you were saying, Alex, or, these complicated large language models like ChatGPT that try to understand language and generate pieces of written words and images or even videos. So I think that's what it boils down to. But I like your introduction, Erica, with the comparison between how we react and respond to AI, because I think it's easy to be labeled as a skeptic, as a Luddite, if you say, oh, if you criticize some aspect of, for instance, generative AI. But it's really because AI, and we have so many different machine learning models that are used for so many different things. I think, it's important to have nuanced conversations. So for instance, if we're talking about environmental impacts of AI, it's usually like, don't say AI is bad for environment because look at, it's also helping us address the climate crisis. And, that's a bit misleading because what we're criticizing are, for instance, the larger language models that consume a lot of power in training and when they're doing inferences. But we have obviously much simpler models that obviously, have made data centers more efficient, that allow us to better model weather climate data. So it really depends. And yeah, we have to start having a bit of a more nuanced conversation and maybe be excited about some use cases of AI and not others. And it's also interesting because I feel a lot of people have this impression that AI just suddenly appeared with ChatGPT. And I'd like to remind people that it's actually an academic field of research that's been going on since the 50s in the past century and has gone through a couple of winters already. So it has a rich history. It's not just something that big tech companies suddenly invented, and we've been actually all using AI in some shape and form for quite many years in different products. What's changing now is the scale of these models and especially these large AI models that can do so much more and process large amounts of data.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Alia, just to add to what you're saying about like, hey, criticism doesn't make me a Luddite. It brings two quotes to mind that I'll paraphrase. Ta-Nehisi Coates, journalist, writer, saying like everyone's always looking for a reason to look away. So when you're faced with hard problems, it's like, what is going to give me that out? And then a heavy paraphrase of James Baldwin that criticism is an act of love. It's like, I want this to work. I want this to work. Let's find a way how. Yeah. Chad, would love to hear you weigh in as well around what do we mean when we talk about AI?
Yeah, I think, well, just first of all, to piggyback on what you were just saying, I'm thinking about Jaron Lanier's definition, or the way he thinks about skepticism is that the critics and the skeptics of a technology like AI are the truly the innovators and truly the ones who want the thing to work and to serve humanity, you know, because they're the ones who see the flaw, are willing to see the flaws and willing to sort of ask the hard questions. So I think that's an important perspective. And so from that perspective, I think you could also define AI as a branding term. Like it's helpful for a lot of these companies to couch it that way because it makes them seem like they're doing something really interesting when what you could say what they're actually doing today with machine learning at least is what Kate Crawford calls large scale computing, you know, or it's like big data science part 2, you know, that kind of thing. So I think it's important in this conversation to just bring it back down to reality that to the extent that there's intelligence in these systems, to a large extent, it's the illusion of intelligence, and it's, you know, it's like number crunching and that kind of thing.
I
Yeah.
think that's a really, really important point that I'm very glad you bring up, is there is a long history of our technology, right? And the kinds of agency and human characteristics that we ascribe to it. There's actually, I have a talk, I might share a talk later, Erica, that you can share among participants that we did a couple of years ago about this, where it's just like the history of how we have entangled ourselves with technologies that are sort of like very present or in our face, and the sort of projection we do onto that. I wholeheartedly concur that the term artificial intelligence is one of the, I was going to say the biggest misnomer. I think actually the biggest misnomer is unsupervised learning, but we can get into that. But they're close. And I think it's critical for us to remain vigilant about what we ascribe to those kinds of terms and what they mean for how we interact with technologies. I think we've talked about this before, Erica, but there's this, if you look at the history of philosophy of technology, right, there's all these ways in which the discourse, I like this, what you're bringing up, Chad, as this notion of like, as a branding term, because how we talk about these things matters so much. But around the first development of electrical systems, right, they called electricity magic because it was so out there and it was so misunderstood. And they call these like these magic devices because they were electrical. And so you could imagine if you transported that to today, you'd have like conferences, all the like the ones we all attend all the time, where like every product pitch would include like, oh, and it has electricity, right? Just as every product pitch you go to now, or any product you hear about, it's like, oh, and it has AI. Can you imagine if we still did that with electrical? We're like, oh yeah, I have this like device, and by the way, it's electrical. And it's just like, you wouldn't, because it is irrelevant, right? Plus we understand electricity more, so we also don't think of it as magic. So I think that's in line and a crucial call out. I appreciate that, Chad.
Yeah, absolutely.
Although to bring to the point of magic, it is in some ways a magical technology. And I mean, even electricity, right? Yeah, we understand it much better, but it's still a bit magical. And for a lot of people, and there's this famous Arthur C. Clarke quote, right? Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And with the work that I'm doing with ethics, we also try to look at storytelling and mythology and all these cautionary tales we have surrounding technology and magic, like the magical sorcerer's apprentice tale that you might be familiar with, right? So what happens when we discover a new technology that is seemingly magical, and we are not yet mature enough to really have the knowledge to deal with it and to be responsible, and we don't know yet the spells for how to make it stop. So those are really interesting things we might even get to the storytelling aspects. And if we also look at human mythology, we have the myths of the golems in Jewish folklore, krats in Estonian folklore, and they talk about, you know, these mythical magical creatures that we create and that are super helpful, but we do not know how to control. So I think that it's very telling. And even when we now listen to the people building these AI systems and products, they talk about it often in religious ways. So There was recently an article in Rolling Stone that called AI a cult. So that might be also another definition based on what we're saying, and AI being used as a marketing term. So AI is certainly many things, and yeah, there's a lot of religious sentiments right now, and believing that AI will magically figure out solutions to all our problems, from climate crisis, social problems, and all of that. So there's a lot of faith that we put in this magic of AI right now.
Absolutely. No, I love that you're bringing that. And I think, I mean, when like our relationship to technology and what even registers as technology, um, I think as things like, we don't think of a light switch as magic now, but originally we would have. And where are we with the AI around that? But I think this is a great segue to how do we build AI with integrity? What is that, or what does it mean? Let's just on the definitions side, and whoever wants to step in. Go for it, Chad.
I can start. Yeah, I think for me, it's a lot of it's about this responsible AI and sort of baking your ethical values as a company into the technology. And there's a lot of scholarship about that and a lot of documented process around that. And I think it's nice to see there's a growing awareness of the importance of it, and it can result in all kinds of benefits. You can have, I think people see it as a cost center and they see it as a sort of like a gatekeeper, but I think the way to look at it is actually more of a way to collaborate and improve product quality, actually like boost your company culture, and become ready for like oncoming regulation, and really build something that you can be proud of in the long term. And so I think the more that you can kind of bring in company values and industry sort of values and synthesize all that, and then bake that into the product from day one and bring that into your processes and everything, the more your product will be something you can be proud of. So that's kind of how I look at it.
I hear both like pride and also maybe sustainability too,
Yeah,
with what you're
that too.
sharing.
That too. Yeah.
I think I would. Oh, God.
Yeah. Do you want to go ahead, Alex?
Maybe I'll
Yeah,
start. Demanding.
A problem we have not yet solved it with technology, right? It's much easier to do in person. Yeah, we have so many different responsible AI principles in Europe, in the European Union. Sorry, UK friends. We have the upcoming EU AI Act that sets some limitations and responsibilities for the providers, especially of general AI systems. So we know a lot of the theory. I think what's missing is that we need to get better at putting all of that theory into practice, and not just in the end product, but thinking how we can, like Chad, you were saying, change the culture and processes at every level. So this doesn't just mean hiring a chief ethics officer or, like a responsible AI role or something like that, but it needs to be really integrated in the fabric of the entire organization. And something that, for instance, very practical project that I'm also involved in, called Responsible Tech Work. We developed this tool called PledgeWorks, which is all about helping and encouraging people to translate high-level values and principles into tangible pledges, commitments. So, for instance, if your core value or principle is that of transparency, what does it mean in the context of the product you're building? Is everyone on the team understanding this value or principle in the same way? And how will you actually make sure that value or principle is respected right now, right? Not like in a general abstract sense, but practically, like, how do we understand it? How do we actually ensure transparency, both as designers, developers, product managers, and all of that? So I think, we need to make ethics and responsibility everyone's jobs as well, and not outsources and rely just on these high level values.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Alex.
Yeah, I would build on that, I think, in that same direction. But I think to me, when we talk about building with integrity, Mari, it means that whatever we build also has to have integrity towards the goal that it's supposed to be doing, right? I think this is where we often see things go quite wrong, is that, and to go back to where we started in terms of like what is AI, is that we often define it by what it does, and what something's function is, right, is usually not singularly explicable, and as such it can mean different things or it can do different things. And so to me, measuring the success of the integrity an AI has, right, is mapping out how much it genuinely overlaps with the thing it set out to do, which comes down to that. And this to me precedes ethics. My background is not in ethics, right? My background is in epistemology. Ethics is ultimately the values that we ascribe to whatever we want to do. Preceding that is, how successful are you at building a system that achieves the goal that you set out to achieve? The problem there is that when we build AI systems, right, they're fundamentally mathematical because it is maths. And so when you have a goal in the world, and that can be very simple, say you want to select a specific person that would be the best fit for a job, right? Or you want to have a word token in the case of a generative AI that is the most likely next word token. Well, most likely is calculable, but if it's the best kind of text that you can generate, those things are fundamentally like best person for the job, best fruit in a fruit bowl, whatever. All of those things are fundamentally not mathematical. And so you have to make decisions about how you approach that project, that problem mathematically, which means you have to make some sort of translation. In most cases, you do this by some sort of proxy, right? I might say, well, for this particular job, I am taking as a proxy that someone has a specific educational background, or they can display a specific kind of skill sets. Or, and in most cases, obviously, you use a number, right? Because it also has to be a culture fit, and it also has to be a thing. All of those things. So some of them are directly measurable, like does someone have this or that education? Fairly binary, one yes or no. This is also how a lot of people aren't getting jobs that might be perfectly suited for jobs. So there's like, how much wiggle room would you create there? All of these things then ultimately map up to a model, right? And that can be sort of like either you're training on a bunch of data, and then you have to make decisions about like what are the parameters of this data set, and then you test the model after you've trained it to see sort of like how close does it get. The end result, irrespective of what you're trying to do, what kind of technology you'll use, is you're building some sort of model that relates to the eventual non-mathematical goal that you are trying to solve for in some way. We don't have very good articulations of what that relationship looks like because you're comparing apples to oranges. And so to me, integrity in building within those models, right, is one, how close is the integrity from the model to the thing you're trying to solve? And do you, as a builder, have integrity about where it does and doesn't work, in terms of like, I, as the owner of this solution, I stand by the approximation that I've built here as sufficient for the problem that I'm trying to solve. And I accept the potential shortcomings that it has as irrelevant to the thing that I'm trying to solve. I think therein lies for me a very crucial element in terms of integrity when it comes to how we take ownership of our models, right? But especially also how our models relate to the problem that they're trying to solve.
Yeah, and that's very measurable.
Well, it's questionable, but it's an excellent point, right? Because what you've been saying, Alec, is essentially often we don't know what best even means, and we know that we have our own biases. What's, I think, dangerous, especially with large AI models now, is that we assume they're going to ingest all this bias data and the way we see the world and somehow become objective and help us figure out what the best thing is, and all these metrics and sometimes things that aren't really that measurable. Even if you take example of something relatively simple as who is the best person for the job, I don't think there's a like a single answer to this, and we've seen AI systems failing all over again and humans failing all over again. I think the danger here is really that we somehow assume that if a model is large enough and it has read enough and learned from enough data, it's somehow going to develop objectivity.
This is such a good point. Yes, I think that is exactly the problematic assumption, right? That is such a good point, is that we have this assumption for objectivity if we just add more data. For me, the most exciting opportunities in this space is when we have models that are allowed to be more specific, right? If we have owners and leaders in this space who are able to say, this is where it works, this is where it doesn't work. I think one of the most powerful things you can do when you're interacting with any builder, with any founder, with any, if you're purchasing AI off the shelf, if you're using AI from someone and you're talking to the person who owns it and builds it, and you ask them, where does it apply and where it doesn't apply, where does it not apply, and they don't have an answer for that, that's a red flag, right? Think about this example of like, okay, we want to hire for our next CEO, fine. And then let's say you build an AI and you can say like, let's skip the technical details. You've built an AI that can identify CEOs, right? And then you would have we have a tenet that we want to be socially responsible. And so as such, we're striving for complete representation. Our AI has to be completely trained on completely representative data. What some people err towards is then to say like, okay, so everyone has to be present in the data set that you're training this on. If you're looking for a CEO, you don't have to have toddlers in your data set because it's not relevant for the problem that you're trying to solve, right? So there's much more efficiency and what I would call integrity if you're able to demarcate like, this is the relevant data. We've done the research as to why this is the relevant data. And as such, it's not actually represented in our data set because we're allowing ourselves to be this specific. I think builders that are able to do that are miles ahead of others because they're combating exactly the point that you make, this notion that everything is going to have to sort of like become this bland beige soup of pure statistical averaging.
For sure.
Yeah.
I think as I just jump in to kind of swerve us from having a fully theoretical conversation, like how do we move into the practical? So like absolutely vital points here. And I'm just hearing a lot around accountability. How can I account for things? And, you know, is what I'm building actually doing what it says, what it promises it will, along with how do we come up with deciding what data sets to be working with or training on. And where I'd love to move us is into the practical. And so a starting point could be, you know, how do I use AI ethically in my organization? What does that look like? So we're looking at the builder, the model, the data, and now the individual. Chad, I don't know if you're up for jumping in on that.
Sure. Yeah, sure. That's a great great segue, great conversation to have. I think it goes to the company culture, of course, as we touched on briefly earlier. I think we have to, you know, the company has to get sort of buy-in and education from everybody involved, all the stakeholders in the whole entire product development process to agree on what the company values are, to agree on what the product should reflect in terms of values, and then to build that in from the beginning and to think about data, as we were just talking about, you know, what data are we using to train and what data are we kind of handling, and to document the process and to get feedback from customers and from users as to their perception of the product and whether their experience is sort of ethical in a certain way. You know, is there bias? Is there sufficient transparency and privacy and all that stuff? So yeah, it's sort of a start to finish kind of process. And actually, if you'll allow me to also bring in one of the questions here from the audience, this question of like, if you're using another party's you know, API and their model, you know, what's your responsibility? I think that's an interesting thing we can kind of talk about more if we want to, but I just think that it's something to think about. I think it's important to think about as a company, like which models are you licensing, and you know, what are the ethical practices of that company that's giving you the model, To what extent can you determine that? And is there a better choice out there that is more ethical for you? It's interesting because I feel like we're at a time now where not many fundamental model companies are really marketing their ethical stance. I mean, Anthropic is one example maybe, but that's, that's an interesting conversation too. So anyways, I'll stop there and turn it over to the rest of us.
Yeah, thank
Yeah.
you. Alia, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, excellent point. I think, it's worth also saying that it's not just proprietary closed AI models from OpenAI, ironically, but there's open source AI models. So looking at some alternatives, a platform like Hugging Face that, compares different open source models. And if you have a certain priority as a company, for instance, if you're focusing on sustainability, my favorite topic, you can go on Hugging Face and look at different LLM leaderboards and also use, for instance, as energy use as a criteria for your selection. So I think it's important to know that we do have choice. And hopefully with regulations such as the EU AI Act, providers will be actually required to disclose more about emissions and other aspects from where they get data, because that's also kind of shrouded in mystery. There's also initiatives that license ethically sourced data. So I think it's really good advice what you were saying. Start with your values, what's important to you as an organization, and then look around. There's more to the AI world than just OpenAI. So just shop around, look at different criteria, really have a conversation about what's important to you. And of course, then work on fine-tuning the models, right? You don't just have to take something off the shelf, consult with machine learning experts that can help you do that. And also consider whether an LLM, I see a lot of companies, just like trying to integrate an LLM and ChatGPT and a chatbot in their products. Maybe that's not the best approach and what your company needs. There's more to machine learning than just large language models. So really consider your options, consider what your priorities are, and try to make an informed choice.
Yeah. Can I just jump in real quick on the open source point? I think that's such an important conversation, such a great point. And I think it's where the interesting work is happening right now. Like Meta just released their new model, which is open source. The licensing is another conversation, but yeah, that's an opportunity for companies to potentially bring in their own data and train the model on a different data set if they want to. That's one of the benefits of open source. Anyways, just wanted to jump in with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one thing that's important to note is in the EU AI Act, to the question that was asked is, if you're using someone else's AI model, you are responsible for its outcomes being compliant with the law. So like there's no really shirking away from those responsibilities. And on top of that, right, if you're using an off-the-shelf LLM, there's a lot you can prompt against, right? If you're building on top of that, you can prompt against most things that you might not want to do. Plus, you can add specificities. But the most important thing is like there is no shirking of this responsibility. I will say, in some of my research, we used to have from I would say 2015 to 2019, I usually had to trick people into being willing to have a conversation about responsible AI. Then interest really surged, and because everyone's like, oh, there is actually something that we need to be doing better. And then since 2022, of course, then it's waned again for this exact reason, right? Because people are thinking, well, I'm not building this model, so I'm not responsible. And so you can see this shift in what people feel responsible about. But with oncoming regulations, in terms of compliance, at least, we will see that companies will be held accountable for the compliance of, even if they're using off the shelf or built on top of other models.
Yeah, I think Europe once again leading the way, I think with regulation here. So we'll see where it goes in the US. But I think no reason not to follow the leaders in that. So I'd love to bring in a few questions from our attendees. So Maijuzu joining us. I'm actually not sure where in Africa, but founder of Africa for Dev. And he's asking, what's the place for marginalized communities in the era of AI innovations?
That's a really great question. Hopefully we make more space for that, and to also understand and train AI models on knowledge that's currently not recorded and available on the internet. There's, for instance, great projects that try to work with indigenous communities and integrate more of that knowledge into AI models, training specific AI models. Although obviously I would say there's a limit to how to the way we can describe the world in a mathematical way, as we were discussing before. So who knows, maybe not all human knowledge is actually learnable by AI models, but yeah, definitely that's a super important point. And there's many projects that try to include marginalized communities and minorities, and yeah, we should definitely be supporting more of that. What I'm worried about is the funding part, right?
Yeah.
I'm so excited about this question. I want to answer it in two different directions. There's one to the point that Alia is making, which I think is a very crucial one. I work with a group out of Mexico who are working on codifying what they call the knowledge of the elders, which is just, tribal knowledge passed down from elders to the tribe. And this is at risk of becoming lost, right? Because oral tradition is going away. Much of it is being codified in Western systems, such as computational systems. What they're trying to do is to, in some way, preserve this knowledge, and they're running into some of the most fundamental base assumptions about what constitutes knowledge in our Western system. It is a fantastic reminder that our computational technology and our computer systems are built within a very specific framework that doesn't even recognize certain things as knowledge, because we are ultimately quite limited in how we do that. I think the more we can diversify, I think this is showing us the edges of our scientific paradigm. I won't go super nerd on like history science, but it's fascinating. And I think this is where I would imagine there's opportunities for alternative modes of computing to somewhat broaden the ways in which we approach, calculate, and compute. If you're interested in this, just come talk to me. I won't belabor the point here. The other point I wanted to make, I'm sharing in the chat a link to the 2022 Mozilla Internet Health Report, where they talk about some of the things happening in the internet. If you scroll down, there is a graphic they made from a paper that came out, that one of the things you have to do when you're building an AI model, right, is you're testing it against a benchmarking data set to see sort of like, does it work outside of the data set that you've trained it on, outside of the thing that you've sort of like built it for. And a research done in 2022, although it was done in 2021, showed that there was an over-indexing, because building a benchmarking data set is kind of a lot of work, right? And so, because it has to be fairly clean data. So everyone was using all the same data sets. And this graph shows this is where those benchmarking data sets were from. So everyone was testing their models against things that were overrepresenting these countries, as you see in the world. Now, this is the problem visualized, right? Because this means that if all these AIs are being tested against these data sets, then we're not checking the validity of how they operate in the rest of it. Imagine making an AI in Angola or wherever, you're benchmarking it against this data set, you're getting results that it isn't up to statistical significance because it doesn't work for like an Angola representative thing. Now, the opportunity that I think is here is that we might start seeing, and I agree there's not as much funding, there's clearly not as much funding, but for the funding that there is, right, I am anticipating seeing some very significantly different results coming out of countries that are less represented here using different benchmarks that will problematize some of the other active AI models and overused models that we're seeing, thus driving interesting insights. And so there's I think that's an opportunity, right? Is to enrich some of the insights that we're seeing, which we can only do if, as I don't mean to belabor this point, if we get specific, right? To say in this context, this is the best working thing in this context on this application. Striving for something that's universally applicable is inherently not going to work, but using sort of like images like this and understanding where some of these sort of like statistical distortions that we're seeing are taking place also shows us where the opportunities for specificity are.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I think, and I really appreciate all the resources that you're sharing as well. I think this is one conversation, the learning and growth for all of us happens beyond this conversation and before this conversation. I feel like we've maybe partially addressed this question, but not entirely directly. We probably just have time for maybe 2, max 3 more questions. So please do bring them. From Akanksha, or actually I shouldn't assume. So Akanksha would like to hear more practical ideas of how LLMs can be made more bias-free. So I think we're talking about that a bit with the data set, especially free of gender bias. So how would you address gender bias in an LLM specifically? I'm guessing we might be looking at the training data. Oh, okay.
I would caution us against wanting to become bias free. I don't think there is such a thing. Any AI has a bias. The first machine learning model differentiated squares from circles from triangles, and as such, the layer that was recognizing triangles had a bias for triangles. That's part of how AIs work. They're discerning, right? They discern something, patterns out of things. That requires having a bias. So to strive for bias-free, I think, is futile. The more productive, and it also obscures and erases a lot of issues, right? The more productive approach there would be to say we want to have mapped out the specific biases and what they serve in terms of how it solves the problem that we're trying to solve. Now, more concretely about sort of like how would you combat that in a large language model, there's a number of things you can do. You can look at you can test the data, right? You can test the data against statistical representation, which you would then test against the statistical representation of where you would apply it. The other thing you can do is also send a data package through the algorithm, right? And see if it's treated differently if you change one variable that indicates gender. So if you have a story about a person and you change the pronouns from she to he, does it change the rest of the story? If you have the same prompt, but you change the gender of, and does it then generate the same story? Those are ways in which you can sort of like discern after the fact, right? If you don't have access to the data set, some of the biases, that's not as precise, but it gives you an indication of those things.
Right. Yeah, that's really helpful.
Yeah, can I
And
just jump in there?
yeah.
Yeah.
Quick jump in, and then we'll do one last question.
Yeah, okay, yeah, just quickly. I think it also it depends on your assessment, kind of like, as Alex is saying, you assess the LLM provider, but then I think that goes back to our conversation about open source models, and if you don't feel confident in their data set, their training, their bias handling, then you can go to an open source model and kind of handle it yourself, essentially.
Yeah, power of open source. I think there's so much untapped there. So
on the topic of open source, we're
Mm.
not quite clear what open source actually means for AI models, because it doesn't necessarily mean that they are using open source or freely available data sets, right? So the definition is a bit unclear, not to go into technicality, but
Sure.
it's not quite as simple as in other types of software. So it gets complicated.
Fair.
Yeah.
Yeah, not a lot of
Yeah.
transparency around data sets, if almost any. I think in our final minutes here, I'd like to come back to a question that posed earlier of, okay, I'm at my, I'm in my workday. I'm using AI, or maybe just starting to use AI. So maybe this is ChatGPT, it could be. How do I approach that in an ethical way? So back to this kind of overall, how can I use AI ethically within my organization, within my day? Chad?
Yeah, it's giving me flashbacks to being an in-house lawyer and wanting people to proactively tell us what they're doing without our knowledge. But yeah, I think, part of it is just making sure that you're aligned or at least telling management or people are aware of, what you're using it for and how you're using it. That might sound a little bit authoritarian or something, but I think it's important to understand what the company's sort of values are around that and have that conversation more broadly within the organization.
Okay, understanding company values.
Mhm.
Great.
Yeah,
Alex,
also
yeah.
be careful about what you're basically sharing with the LLMs, especially if you're allowing it to be trained on your data. And I would also advise you to be curious about where the answers and suggestions are coming from, like what biases are in the suggestions. Why is it answering what you're asking it in a certain way? And it's hard to be super prescriptive and give a one answer, as you were saying
Sure.
before, Alex, right? There is no one strategy or one ethics to rule them all. So also, be mindful, be curious about your own values and what's important to you, and go from there and try to really think about what's important to you and be curious, learn, be critical. Being critical, like we started with, right, doesn't mean you're against it and will not be using it at all. But being critical and curious, I would say.
Yeah.
is
Okay.
important.
Discernment, personal values, company values. Alex, anything you want to add to that?
No, I like the synthesis of those two, right? It's like there is no one ethics to rule them all,
Right.
meaning that you have to become within your organization, top to bottom, aware of what you're executing against and what you're doing and why you're doing it, which also means that if then something goes wrong, you're willing to stand by that solution, right? It's ownership. And so I think that building a context specific ethics for the application that you're building, that may even be specific to the point of one AI versus another AI that you're also using in your company. So wholeheartedly concur with both of them.
For a final question, what I'd love to know from each of you is, as we build AI responsibly, as we hopefully build AI responsibly, right? So what is it that you see? What's that future point? And it might get to like your utopian vision for AI, but what do you see as possible as we build AI with integrity?
I think if I can start, it brings me back to this question from earlier, in terms of thinking about marginalized communities and how AI is impacting them or whether or not they're being considered. I think it's important to kind of broaden out. I mean, if I can be more of a philosopher for a moment, it's important to broaden out the view and the question and to think about like in terms of the technology you're using, what do the companies behind that believe and what are their priorities and what direction are they heading in? And so much of the sort of drive in Silicon Valley, especially, is toward building AGI and superintelligence, and that's because they think the solution to all of our problems as a humanity is to create some kind of like messiah that can come and save us. And I think it's a little out of touch, and I think like it does further marginalize people because it's not solving these problems that people need to solve on the ground, today, right now. And so I think it's important to think about like which companies are sort of have their priorities in the right order, and should you work with them instead. And the more I think we as individuals and we as smaller companies and everything are asking these questions and being discerning, the more that will hopefully drive the reprioritization of some of these companies' values. So that's part of it, I think. And then I think it just goes back to the rest of our conversation from earlier in terms of internally to your own organization. What kind of conversations are you having? What kind of values are you kind of driving forward with your products and services?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, philosophy is welcome here in our final minutes. Alex, did you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I think if I had maybe I'm not being ambitious enough, but I think a utopian vision for me would be that I genuinely think we'll see leaders do in the next couple of years is owners, leaders, builders being explicit about this is what this AI does and this is what it doesn't. I think to Chad's AGI point, right, is or building like some universal AI that can do anything. That's not going to happen. There's no reason to assume there genuinely is no reason to assume that it will. So the power for me lies within building the best AIs for the best context, for the best application, which will require us to be, critical about what it can't do. So my utopia is a world in which CEOs go about proclaiming not just proudly what their AI does, but also proudly what it doesn't do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Alia, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, instead of considering utopias, I would like to invite all of us to consider rainbow mirror visions. So somewhere the place in between the dystopian black mirrors that we see on Netflix and, the bright utopian mirrors where AI is perfect and wonderful and, the brave new world. And, embrace the nuance, the complexity, not try to hide away the shadows, ignore the shadows, pretend the problems aren't there. And so to live in this rainbow space of plurality and nuance where we can talk about different things with embracing complexity and acknowledging the problems and not pretend everything is perfect. So I think also a key is to not outsource responsibility. We often talk about responsible AI, but it comes down to humans making a conscious choice to be responsible to each other, to the planet, to other life on our planet, and collectively just take a deep breath and stop rushing towards AGI without really understanding what it is for and what we actually value and want to get out of there.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you all so much. Thank you to everyone who joined. It's really just also been a really beautiful space as well. Just really appreciating what everyone's bringing and building. And also love that concept of rainbow mirrors. So that is new to me. So let this conversation continue and separately and together. And massive thanks to all of you, Chad, Alex, Alia, for leading this conversation.
Thank you so much. This is wonderful. Yeah.
Thanks. Much
Thanks
love.
for having me.
Yeah. Thank you all. Thanks to everyone for joining. And yes, we will be following up with an email with links and all of that. So Zoom chat will not get lost. All right. Have a good evening, good day, good morning. Bye,
Thanks,
y'all.
everyone.